Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm going to sound a little strange today. I have allergies. I feel wonderful, but my voice does not. So if you like to turn it down low to the radio, that's what today's going to be. If you would go ahead, open your Bible to Psalm 77. Psalm 77 is where we're going to be this morning. Um, we're coming to the conclusion, at least in our study for the Psalms. We have 3 more lessons left. I'm not sure if the new booklets are going to come in this week or early next week, but we'll get those real soon. So we'll go ahead and begin with a word of prayer, and then we will jump into our class this morning. Brother Lum, can you lead us in that prayer? Amen. When we look at Exodus chapter 13, we find the children of Israel are about to cross the Red Sea. In fact, what makes chapter 13 so incredible in light of the amazing plagues and judgments that God had shown Israel, they see many of his wonders. And we find the children of Israel, once they come out of Egypt, they find themselves stuck between, so to speak, a rock and a hard place. They find themselves before the Red Sea, and behind them they see Pharaoh and his 600 choice chariots chasing after Israel. And God decides to come down as a cloud of light to the Israelites, but a cloud of darkness to the Egyptians to confound them. And when the children of Israel find themselves stuck between this mountainous cavern, if you want to call it that, and an ocean on the other side, they turn around and they cry out to Moses by saying, "We would have been better if we would have just stayed in Egypt rather than you bringing us out, and we die." And Moses turns to the Lord, and he asks God, why does he do this? And there's something really powerful that we find in chapter 14 of Exodus, beginning in verse 13. Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, stand still. See the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace." What we're going to find in Psalm 77 is if you have ever had a moment in your life where you could not breathe, you could not think, all the emotions were running to the forefront of your mind, your hands were trembling, you had no strength in your legs, and all you want to do is scream and yell how unjust and how fair life is. Psalm 77 is a pretty good psalm for you. What we're going to find in Psalm 77 this morning is we're going to find an individual who is at that moment in his life, and he's trying to find answers. He's going to reassure himself with some of the things that he knows about God, but what he's also going to illustrate for us is that when we find ourselves at wit's end, how does the psalmist demonstrate how we can work through these trials that really don't seem like what 2 Corinthians 4:16 and following would tell us? Light afflictions. When you're having a world-ending crisis in your life, does it really feel like a light affliction? Or does it feel like your entire life is in this moment and you can't focus on anything else? When life happens, that's all we can think about. And Psalm 77 is going to give us a couple of solutions of how we can work through those problems that seem like there's not going to be light at the end of the tunnel, but there really is. So if we begin in Psalm 77, I want you to notice this begins with a cry, a scream of sorts. If you could think of a primal yell, that's how this psalm begins. I cried out to God with my voice, to God with my voice, and he gave ear to me. In the day of my trouble I sought the Lord. My hand was stretched out in the night without ceasing. My soul refused to be comforted. I remembered God and was troubled. I complained, and my spirit was overwhelmed. Now, there's an interesting word in verse number 3 as we connect these ideas. It's the idea of complain. In the Hebrew, this is a weird word because it's meditating with thanks and praise. If we think of someone complaining, we're talking about maybe someone who's disgruntled with someone or something. They have some anger built up and they're trying to cry out to someone to just give people a piece of their mind. That's what we think of complaining. In the Hebrew, that's not what's under consideration here. The idea of complaining towards God is meditating about God while giving thanks and praise towards Him. Now, that's a very different image of complaining than how we look at the word complain. So let's think of this in what we're viewing here in the first 3 verses before we look at some of these questions to help guide us how we can cry out to God in the day of trouble. Verse number 2, he would say, in the day of trouble. It implies that not every day is like this. It's almost like this morning. Not every Sunday it's raining. Not every Monday it's raining, even though it feels like every Monday is a rainy day, doesn't it? But every day's different. So whatever he's going through, at least in this particular moment, he seeks out God. But notice how often he seeks out God. It says in the day, that implies daylight, but then look at what time his hands are stretched out. Through the night, I did not find deliverance in the daytime, and I'm not finding deliverance at nighttime. This is an ongoing process. So this isn't just a temporary trouble that just lasts a couple minutes and it's gone, but rather this is someone who's really struggling. This is messing with my mental faculties. This is messing with my well-being. I can't think about anything else, and this is the forefront of my mind. So as he stretches out his hands towards God at night, notice verse number 2, my soul refused to be comforted. Has someone ever given you good advice when you're feeling emotionally distraught? And truly it was good advice, but that is not what you wanted to hear in that moment. You wanted to just embrace the emotions you were feeling. You didn't want anybody to comfort you. You just needed to give someone a piece of your mind. And maybe not in a mean way, but you just needed to express yourself to someone. While that can be good, what we're going to find is this coming back to the idea of verse number 3, I remember God. In light of what my troubles are, I remembered God, and I was troubled. Because of this reason, if God finds that you're at a place in your life that is world-shattering, what does God offer you that nobody else can probably give you in that moment? What do we call that? Someone who's willing to listen in your times of trouble. Could be humbleness. Could be stress. So we're expressing our worries, our concerns. We're pretty much pouring out our heart. What do we call that to someone who we're just pouring out our heart to? And we're just telling them everything that's going on in our life. Well, yeah. That's, huh? confiding. What's another name for that kind of person? A confidant, a counselor of sorts. We're looking for someone who can offer us comfort. Now, notice again in verse number 2, I refused to be comforted. Verse 3, I remembered God, and now I find myself in a spot. I'm conflicted. God wants to help me. I don't want to be helped. But as I find myself in this time of trouble, I find there's someone who can actually deliver me if I'm willing to listen to him. So as I look at verse number 3, I see the comfort that God provides. And now I'm stuck between, should I wallow in my sorrows or should I start going towards the path of finding comfort? So I meditate with praise and thanksgiving to God, and his findings, verse 3, overwhelming. You know, we sing the song, when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, God has taught us to say, what? It is well with my soul. Now, I just had the guy's name. The writer of that song, he was not going through a good time in life. He had just lost his daughter, his wife, and I believe daughter or two daughters on a ship that was going to a place that they had invested in America. And as he was going on the boat from their home to their new home, they were going right over the spot where the ship sank, where he lost his wife and his daughter. And he wrote that song to thank God for the idea that regardless of what I go through, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. Now, that's not to say God is going to say, this doesn't matter. He's going to offer comfort in such a way that not only I can find consolation through my losses, but also he'll provide a way so that, verse 3, when I find myself in that place, I don't want to be comforted, but God's offering me a path of comfort that no one else has offered me before. He's wanting to help me walk through my problems so that I don't find myself completely severed from the great Comforter. So as we go through verse 4 and following, I want you to notice the different, positions of consolation that appear through this text, but also there's going to be some questions from the psalmist that I think are really important when we find ourselves in times of trouble and persecution. Notice verse number 4, you hold my eyelids open. I'm so troubled that I cannot speak. Verse 4 implies the idea that I am so tired and I can't get any kind of rest. I'm in such distress that I just can't go to sleep. You ever had those nights? Sleepless nights? Worries, anxieties, all in your mind throughout the night, and they just won't turn off. So what God offers through this, I find interesting, is the idea you hold my eyelids. Not you keep, you hold. As I'm struggling to find an answer, what God is about to show the psalmist here, really what the psalmist is about to show us about God, is going to be, a beautiful way of looking at how we work through our troubles without I think some people are against the idea of a fix-it person. If you have problems, sometimes you don't want someone to fix it. You just want someone to listen. And that's okay. That's good. We need someone to listen. And we don't need to always have the answer of how to fix those problems, but God's going to offer more than just a fix-it. He's going to give us a pathway here through these problems that's going to guide us, verse number 6, guide us through the night. Now, what the psalmist is going to do to try to consider, because I can't speak, and I'm thinking more than I am speaking, I want you to notice from verse 5 to verse number 15, there are a couple different things that we find from the psalmist. First, he's going to take a reflection back on God. I'm troubled when I consider what God offers, and I'm stuck between not wanting any kind of help to pursuing the kind of help that he gives me. And I long for this kind of deliverance. and it keeps my eyelids open. So notice verse number 5. What does he consider? I consider the days of old, the years of ancient times. I call to remembrance my song in the night. I meditate within my heart, and my spirit makes diligent search. Now this could be two different places. Well, really it could be three. One place could be he is replaying whatever is troubling him over and over and over and over and over. You ever gone through something and you ask the question, what could I have done different? If only I'd have done, then this wouldn't have, and they'd still be, and we have all kinds of hypotheticals. But with God, that's a different investigation. And that brings to a second outlook. Instead of reviewing what I could have, should have, and maybe have been better if I did, he looks back on what God has done. In fact, what he ends up doing, I want to reflect on how God helped people who have been in situations that I'm finding myself in right now. So he looks back into the scriptures of old, and he looks into, notice verse number 6, I call to remembrance my song in the night. What kind of song do you think troubles bring about? Nobody knows the troubles I've seen. But he's talking about this tune that I'm going through in life, these kind of sorrows. As I look within my heart, notice the word diligent search. He is going to exhaustively, while he is exhausted, look into every aspect of how God has delivered someone from this type of trial. Pause. If we're not doing the same thing today, we will not keep our faith in God when the hard times of life hit. When is the best time to prepare for the inevitable times of life that we know are further down the road, but we know they're coming? What's the best way to prepare, or when's the best time to prepare? Yeah, yesterday and today. If you didn't start yesterday, right now is a really good time. We need to brace ourselves for those moments. In fact, one of the classes I'll be teaching next quarter at the school is world religions, and people would think that deals with like Hinduism and Buddhism and New Age mysticism, and it does to an extent. But I want the students to be able to prove to me, why do they believe in God? I don't want you to give me just my parents always taught me, I want you to show me and tell me, why do you believe in God? We're living in a day and age where kids do not want to hear anything about God. Church is a thing for older folk, and if you're not smart, that's where people go to learn about God. And their perception of God is a reflection of their heart, but where's your faith? Is your faith your own? The idea of what God is calling off here, at least what the psalmist is calling here, is if I'm going to make an exhaustive search about God, I need to make sure that I truly believe in the things that I say that I believe in about God. No more of this hypocrisy stuff. That's the book of Matthew. You've heard it's been said. I say to you, they've taught you in the synagogues, but I say don't do what they're doing, but do what they're teaching. And we don't want to live that kind of lifestyle, and I'm not accusing anyone of doing it, but if we're not able to prove why we believe and what we believe in, then it does no good to, I find this of interest, and it is a study. I don't understand the individuals who only come 1 hour on Sunday, and that's it. You never hear from them the rest of the week, and then they come back. And you never hear from them again the rest of the week, and they never come back. They don't even show any kind of interest in any other activities of the church. What that shows me is that someone has an admiration for God, but they don't have a devotion towards God. There's a difference between seeing someone struggling in their Christianity as opposed to someone who just kind of adorns their life with church, and they put on Christianity like a coat, and once they get done with church, they take it off and they go about their entire life, and they don't think twice about it. But think about the repercussions of that. If you live that kind of Christianity, who all is that going to affect? Let's start with the closest individual that's going to affect. if you have a very careless way of being a Christian. On the immediate impact, who's that going to affect? Myself. That's pretty big. I'm going to be held accountable because I was careless about myself. Who else is that going to affect? So expand the circle of influence. So I got my family, people who I spend a whole lot of time with, and they probably see a side of me that nobody else gets to see. As I expand beyond my family, I go to my friends and coworkers, or maybe some of your friends are a part of your family, and that's good. It's good to have those kind of relationships. But that influence keeps going and going and going. If I could care less about myself and God on the immediate scale or the immediate level, it's going to have eternal repercussions for everyone around me. And God's going to say, look at what you did because you were careless in your Christianity. That's not what the psalmist is going to paint here. He's saying, as I am exhausted and I am exhaustively looking into God, notice the questions that he asks in verse 7, 8, and 9. These are really good questions when you find yourself stuck between a rock and a hard place in life. I think everyone at some point has asked one of these 6 questions. Notice beginning in verse 7, will the Lord cast off forever? Will he be favorable no more? Has his mercy ceased forever? Has his promises failed forevermore? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his tender mercies? Notice where he's directing all of these questions, all of these about God. But notice in light of verse 7, I'm seeking comfort, I'm seeking wisdom, I'm seeking some kind of advice, Lord. Is it the case that I'm going through this? Will God just keep letting it happen this way? Is there ever going to be an end to my darkest night? Is he not going to show me his favor or show any kind of blessing toward me? Notice verse number 9, in light of forgiving me of my sins. Have I committed that sin where I just can't find forgiveness anymore? That's a big deal with a lot of younger Christians today and younger individuals. I've just done too many bad things in my life. God can't forgive me. Well, he can. But you've probably had this thought. He can't forgive someone who's done what I've done. Oh, yes, he can. Will his mercy cease forever? Has his promise failed forevermore? Notice in light of I've sinned and God's not showing me compassion, but in light of his promise, how many people is God willing to perish for all eternity? None. God wants all men to come to repentance. He's not willing that any should perish. That's what 1 Peter 3 or 2 Peter 3:9 would tell me. And as I look at that idea, has God's promise failed forevermore? Will he not give me some kind of deliverance? Has he forgotten? Notice the two sides of God. Has he forgotten to be gracious, finding favor with God? In his anger, has he shut up his tender mercies? Bring up again Proverbs 16:6. Where there is mercy and truth, atonement is provided. God can't give me his favor. God can't even give me compassion. You ever thought about this? They didn't talk to me today. Are they mad at me? Did I do something wrong? You ever kind of assume people's motives before you actually go to them and you talk to them? Everybody does that at some point in life. And that's part of humanity. Yeah, paranoia. And you're not really sure how people are going to respond. You know, I always had the inkling that my siblings were evil, and then I really got to know them, and my suspicions were true. They were evil. I'm kidding. But sometimes in light of our friendships, and even in our closest relationships, I find that the starting place is from a child to the parent. There's a lot of, when you do something wrong, and you really don't want to get in trouble, your first thought is, Mom and Dad are going to kill me. And sometimes they did. But sometimes when I thought that I was really, really in trouble, and you could see it on my face, or whoever did it, Mom and Dad were a little bit more lenient in how they executed judgment, not the child, judgment and discipline in those situations. And that's that kind of helps us when we're trying to work with other people. Don't be presumptive. Now, should we maybe be cautious in if we're going to talk to someone? Maybe consider, what if they act this way? How will I respond? What if they act in a completely different way? How am I going to respond? Is there anything wrong with hypothesizing how someone may respond to you going to them? No, that's just being careful. Now, if you assume that I know for a fact they're going to respond this way, if you make that assumption and you refuse to go to someone because you're running it off of, I know they're going to act that way, is that wrong? I don't know. Okay, I was like, I don't know if that's an accusation or an answer.
But there's no way. You might assume somebody's not going to be open to accept the gospel.
Yeah, and that's the idea. Always leave some room there for benefit of the doubt. Just because you have a thought of someone, even if you know them really well, they may actually act that way, but they may not. And we have to leave that room for long-suffering and forbearance and patience with one another, not to get to that point to where we start to presume how people are going to act in every situation, and that's especially true with God. I find more times than not, any time that I made a presumption of how I thought God would respond, for the most part, with just very, very few occasions, for the most part, I've always been wrong in how God worked through that situation, and God did something even greater than what I had even anticipated. And I think that's why we find passages like in Colossians and Ephesians and 2 Corinthians, this idea that God can do abundantly above all that we ask or think, and that God truly does give us all these kind of blessings if we go for Him and toward Him, especially in times of trouble. God can work through our troubles where we don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. We need to remember where God is. He exists outside of time. He can see every single possible route that our troubles can take us. But what if we go to God and we take those troubles to God? And we notice again, exhaustively, verse number 6, my spirit makes diligent search in finding out the answers to these questions. Now, I find it of interest in light of, does anybody have any more comments about that before we go a little bit deeper? Okay, so I find that in this problem that the psalmist is going through, notice in verse number 10, I said, this is my anguish. He acknowledges the fact, I'm going through a problem. I can't deny that. And that's something actually good to acknowledge. If you're going through a problem, it doesn't necessarily mean you're the problem, but if you're going through a problem, acknowledge, I'm suffering, I'm struggling. Now, it's not saying that he's accepting help yet. He's just identifying, I'm in a problem and I don't have the answer. This is what troubles me. Everything that I try to do, I can't find a way of escape. But when I look at what God did, and notice he's going to bring up 5 different things about God. In English translations, you're going to find a couple of these words are the same in English, but there's like a different nuance in the Hebrew word. And I'll explain that here in a moment. Notice these 5 things, verse 10 through 12. Though I'm going through this problem, this is my anguish, my despair, my infirmity, I will remember, number 1, the years of the right hand of the Most High. Number 2, I will remember the works of the Lord. Number 3, surely I will remember your wonders of old. Number 4, verse 12, I will also meditate on all your work. And number 5, and talk of your deeds. As I look at all 5 of these, I find the word work or works 2 or 3 times, depending on your translation. But all 3 of those words are different Hebrew words, which makes me have to look a little bit closer at the text. Notice he begins with, I look at God's yearbook, and I look at all the amazing wonders. If God were to have a yearbook of sorts, I guess we could call that the scriptures. If I look back at the Old Testament and I see all the grand display of what God did for his people in times past, look at what God did with Adam and Eve. Look at what he did with Noah and his family. Look at what he did with Abraham, with Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. Look what he did with the children of Israel as they were crossing the Red Sea. Look at how even though they were distasteful towards God, look at how God still extended his mercy and his forgiveness towards all of his people. Look at how he was with that generation before they went into the promised land, and when they went into the promised land. Look at the stories of Joshua and Caleb. Look at the story of the judges and God delivering them through them. Look at the beginning of the kings and their stories. There are so many things God has done. Look at the years of the right hand of the Majesty on high. Does it look like God takes care of his people in times of trouble? And that's the point. I find it hard when all I'm focusing on is look at all the things that my life has led up to for this moment. And I need to consider I'm not the only one who has gone through this. That's 1 Corinthians 10:13. Do not think that what you're going through is uncommon to man. But what you're going through, whether it's a temptation or it's a test or a trial, such is common to mankind. So what if you considered how God worked with those individuals in times past? It doesn't mean that every attribute about that person fits what you're going through at that moment, but it sure does make you feel better if you ask God, what are your credentials that makes you so confident in helping me through my problems? And I look back at the Old Testament and I say, wow, I don't think I've ever met someone with that kind of resume, and you never will. And if God could do all those things then, can he not help you through your problems now? So as I look at the years of the right hand of the Most High, as you have ruled, it's not been the greatest picture in terms of what mankind has chosen to do, but what God has chosen to do in light of mankind's choices, whether they chose the wrong thing or the right thing or aim for the middle of the road. I find that God is very flexible and he knows how to work within mankind's decisions. That's why he's higher than us. He's greater than us. He knows more than us. He's all powerful. He made us. Oftentimes we say, sometimes I think my parents knew me better than I knew myself. In some ways, that can be a flawed way of thinking. But if I look in the ultimate sense of the Creator towards the created, I'm amazed when God shows me things about myself I never knew was there. And God saw there all along. So as I look at the years of the Most High, surely he can help me in my times. Though my years are shortened, I find that the Eternal One is someone who will help me just as he did in times past. As I look in verse number 11 and I look at this second word, I will remember the works of the Lord. This is the idea of one who is kind of like a building project of sorts. We love those, don't we, David? The building projects of sorts. There is a job that needs to be done, and God has built upon the supplies that are there. So think of the different, personalities that God was working with. What was the difference in how he worked with Adam and Eve versus how he worked with Noah versus how he worked with Abraham and how he worked with Jacob and with Joseph and with any of the judges, Joshua, Moses? They were all different people, but I find that God still worked with them in the same way. He gave them all his attention, all his protection, all of his mercy at times, all of his grace at times. God gave them everything they needed. And if that's how God builds upon working through my problems from their life, then I look at my lifetime and I see that God can do the same thing. I just may not see all the different components that are working through my troubles. So as I look at this first idea of the works of the Lord, God builds upon where I am. Thirdly, surely I will remember your wonders of old. Quite literally, your miracles in times past. Think of, we call them the 10 plagues, but some translation have the 10 wonders of God. And they truly were. You look at what the wonders God did in the wilderness and the wonders that God did with whether we look at the divided kingdom and we looked at how God, through the prophets, performed miracles. You recall the raising of the widow's son in what was it, Zaphnath Paranea? I don't remember how to say that. But there was a child that was brought back to life. We have food that doesn't corrupt. If God can do all that, then God can also, in light of how he did amazing things, can still do amazing things through his providence today. Fourthly, I will meditate. Now, it uses the word works again, but this is a different idea of works. This is not one who builds upon certain things, but these are accomplishments, what God strives to labor for. So if I look back at the yearbook of God, and next to it I find the accomplishments that God had done throughout the life of his yearbook, I'm looking at all the amazing stories and all the different aspects of his heart that he displays to all those in times past. And I also look at the last word, talk of your deeds, or sometimes translation has it, works. How did God respond to man's inadequacies, or man's hesitancies, or man's confidence, or when man sinned against God? How did God work with them? And if he worked with them, then again, I keep going back to this point because that's what the psalmist is trying to say. If he could do it then he could do it now. Verse 13 through 14. This is the ending conclusion of the psalmist after he has done this exhaustive search while he is working through his troubles. Notice he finds deliverance on many, many levels. Your way, O God, is in thee, and we'll talk about this next week. Your way, O God, is in the sanctuary. It's in the utmost place of holiness and purity. Now, if someone were to say they were going through troubles, have you ever told anyone as your first resort of how to work through those troubles, oh, you need to look into the holiness of God? Does that seem like a weird thing to tell people? But as I look into the holiness of God, what makes God so holy? Any ideas? He's sinless. He's good. Good in what sense? So he is quite literally called no man good, for there's only one good in heaven. It is the Father. He is the source of everything that's good. What else? He's above all in both location and in terms of his presence and his authority. He's above all. So where the psalmist is driving our attention, your way, O God, is in the holy place. Your character of how you respond to my trials, I must look to where you seat yourself. And when I'm looking at heaven's throne, I'm reminded of a passage that sounds something like, we can come before God through Jesus, having boldness to pray or ask of anything before his throne. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of God. Thus we have boldness in the day of trouble to pray to him, ask him for help, because we have someone who is on our side. And notice he would say, who is so great a God as our God? You're the God who does wonders. You've declared your strength among the people, and you have with your arm redeemed your people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph. Now that's an interesting statement, because if you look at, well, how many kids did Jacob have? He had 12. Now, out of those 12 sons, how many of those 12 did not receive tribes under their name? 2. There were 2. Now, when I say tribes, I'm not talking about families. What I'm talking about is an established territory in the Promised Land. Okay. Tribe, not trials. 2 of the 12 sons of Jacob did not receive territories. Who were those 2? Levi and Joseph. Now we find from Joseph that 2 of his sons did receive territories, and that would be Manasseh and Ephraim. So if I'm looking at this list, You're the God who does wonders. Who so great a God is our God? You've declared your strength among the people, and with your arm you've redeemed your people. Who are your people? Those who were of the original promise, the original 12, and those who were blessed from within those 12. And I look within, does God have any more gifts or promises, or does he have any more protection that he can offer me if I choose to be his? Yes. He has more than enough for the generation now and the generation to come. And that's what I find in light of how we are to look at God when we cry out to him. If I look upon all his works, he can do more than enough to help me through my troubles, but not just me. He can help you through your troubles, even as I'm going through my troubles. And we're all having earth-shattering events that seems like an apocalypse of sorts, and it's just the end of all time. But God has that kind of power. He can help you. He can help me at the same time. And do you find it difficult if a lot of your friends are having problems at the same time? Have you ever asked yourself, how in the world am I going to be able to help all these different people? I don't have that kind of energy. I don't have that kind of positivity. I just don't know how to work through that. Because after I'm done talking with one person, I'm feeling drained from all that attention I'm giving them. But God can do that to every single human being, and it doesn't even faze him. Now, what's even more incredible about this is that oftentimes, if you look at the grand scheme of things, there are still people who will reject the comfort that God gives. The psalmist now turns our attention to something that also was created during the same time that we were created, but without any hesitation. This aspect of creation has always turned to God, regardless of what God says, does, and wants. He turns to nature. And notice verse 16 through verse 20. The waters saw you, O God. The waters saw you. They were afraid. The depths also trembled. The clouds poured out water, and the skies sent out a sound. Your arrows also flashed about. The voice of your thunder was in the whirlwind, and the lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook, and your way was in the sea, your path in the great waters. Your footsteps were not known, and you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. As I look at verse 16, 17, and 18, water isn't that scary unless it's too deep and you find yourself not being able to keep yourself afloat above water, especially if you find yourself in deep waters during the time of a storm, don't you think? You have no life raft, you have no float, you're finding yourself at the mercy of the sea. But as I look at nature, when nature in and of itself hears God, they're afraid. Those places I'm terrified of, the deep places where I don't find stability, even my darkest days will be afraid when God intermingles with them. When I look at the clouds poured out water and the skies sent out a sound, think of the storms that have recently gone through here. In light of how terrifying that is for us here on earth, they're terrified of God when God intervenes and intermingles. Your voice of your thunder was in the whirlwind. The lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. All of this, whether my insecure places or things above me or things around me that shake me, it may seem like, verse 19, where God's taking me, seems like it's taking me into utter darkness. It seems like it's taking me into a very deep depth I'm not comfortable going through. And your footsteps were not known. Well, they weren't known if I'm trying to do this by myself. But I do find verse 20, that amidst all of these storms, all of this uncertainty, whether below, above, and before me, I find that God will still lead me. And he has leaders to help me do so. In the past, it would have been Moses and Aaron. In the present, we also have leaders of sorts, spiritual leaders, that help guide us and direct us, Ephesians 4:11 and following. But in the ultimate sense, we have that great shepherd, that high priest, the most high king, the great comforter, who is sitting at the right hand of God, and his name is Jesus. If we keep in mind all the things that God has done in times past and how he did amazing things to lead people out of their troubles, you look down to you today and you take into consideration, out of all the troubles that I'm going through, are you asking the same questions that the psalmist asked? How long? Where's your mercy? Where's your grace? Will you keep your promises from me? And as I exhaustively look into that, do you consider the years of God? Do you consider the works of God? Do you consider his mighty wonders? Do you consider his building up works and his deeds, how they've constantly worked across humanity's timeline? If God does that then what's he doing in your life now? Because we have an even greater leader than what those in the Old Testament have. We have Jesus. And what greater comforter can we have than God's only begotten Son? When we find ourselves crying out to God in prayer, I hope that we are crying out to God for help. But I also hope that when it seems like verse 19, that way seems uncertain, how God's going to help us reach from where we are to where we want to be prepared to accept the idea that God may take you in a way you did not anticipate, but will you trust God to bring you into greener pastures than what you ever thought possible? We must trust in God with our entire being, and if we trust any less with him, then we can cry out to God all day. We'll never find deliverance. So thank you for your time and attention. Lord willing, next week we're going one psalm over. We're going to Psalm 78 as we talk about telling about God to future generations. And that's going to be a really good lesson. So thank you for your time and attention. We'll be back in about 15 minutes.